Speaking of Robert Mueller, his report's extensive detailing of Russian interference in the 2016 election has renewed media soul-searching over the role it played in what was clearly a foreign campaign against the United States. And with the 2020 election approaching, the media is debating how it might handle hacked documents going forward. You know the story. Just before the 2016 Democratic National Convention, WikiLeaks published thousands of hacked internal party emails.
A potential scandal breaking ahead of the DNC.
The latest emails released by WikiLeaks.
The Clinton campaign trying to tie Donald Trump to those hacked DNC emails.
The media coverage was intense, putting Hillary Clinton's campaign on the defensive for weeks, and WikiLeaks dismissing questions that Russia was their source.
A push for journalists to reveal their sources by other journalists. Disgusting.
Fast forward to now with this blunt conclusion from the Mueller report. The Russian government interfered in the 2016 presidential election in sweeping and systematic fashion. It's now clear that the media was complicit in Russia's success, says Vox editor Ezra Klein.
There was a crime committed to steal information from the Democratic National Committee and then launder it through the press. And we cooperated with that, often knowing exactly what it was.
Klein says he has no easy answers, but that journalists need to think ahead to similar tactics in 2020.
So we need to think a bit about what our rubric is for thinking about this the next time it happens.
And that's a point that national security expert and WGBH contributor Juliet Kayyem agrees with.
The media has to start having some standards by which they will determine whether things stolen, not leaked, things stolen, will be utilized by them to amplify the sort of criminal behavior by a foreign entity.
A matter of when, not if. Yeah, so Tom, this is going to come up. We know it's going to come up, probably sooner rather than later. The media is going to print it. They're going to report it. They're going to put it. Should they just disclose where they got it? This was stolen from. We believe it came from, and then go ahead with it, or do you weigh it differently?
The first part of that, absolutely right. The media ought to be as transparent as possible. We always ought to be able to say this is the source as best we know. I think one of the mistakes was to say this was WikiLeaks without taking the step beyond, well, where did WikiLeaks get it and how did they get it? But I think the difference between whether something is stolen or whether it's leaked almost becomes irrelevant when it gets to the journalist. To the journalist, the idea is, all right, what is the validity of it? Is there news value to this? What is the broader context? And what do I really need to share with my viewers or my readers as to how they ought to weigh this? And again, I think right now we're going to do the same thing in the 2020 campaign. If we get access to documents that, in our view, make news, are newsworthy, we will go ahead and put it. We do it with grand jury testimony. That's illegal. That's stolen also. But you weigh it and then decide where do you go with it.
Well, I mean, as we discussed last week, the New York Times just used stolen Russian emails in a profile of Neera Tanden just to make it a better read. So we're not learning anything. I agree with everything Tom said, but I would add to that, the problem in 2016 was that the media knew that they had this treasure trove of emails from the Clinton side and nothing from the Trump side. And they just went crazy with the Clinton stuff without really going that extra step and pointing out that presumably there's a lot of Trump stuff out there, too, that we don't have access to.
I agree with Tom. I agree with Dan. It's all about context. It's all about good journalism practices. Where did the information come from? Giving the public as much information as possible so they can put it into context. And whether it's stolen or whether it's given to you, I think that is part of the context. Who paid for it? Did somebody pay for it? What was the flow of information? The people who gave it to you, what are their motivations? Who do they work for? As they said a long time ago, follow the money. And I think that's still important today.
I actually don't know if it's going to play out quite the same way in 2020 that it did in 2016 because I'm not sure that in 2020 there's going to be an entity analogous to WikiLeaks that is going to be the outlet that puts this stuff out there and then gives the press cover to report on the contents of the materials in question. I mean, there were still people who bought the, I think, fallacy that WikiLeaks was some sort of, well, we know it's a fallacy, that WikiLeaks was a neutral dispenser of information. I had this really irritating back and forth with Glenn Greenwald on Twitter during the 2016 campaign where he said, well, I'm sure he would, Assange would publish materials related to Trump if he had them. He just doesn't have them. No, he wouldn't have. If there's not a WikiLeaks, then it's, say, the New York Times getting an email involving a bunch of data about Donald Trump without someone else already having put it out there, giving them cover to publish it. So I think absent that, it might be different. If that makes sense. That makes
no,
sense.
I understand, but I think there's going to be another out. There's the DC Leaks, and there's going to be other
maybe
organizations who figure out how to do this. I mean, Julian Assange did not have a lock on that.
No, he didn't. That's true.